friends, Elisa Childers here. Our culture is changing at a rapid rate, and how can we as Christians navigate these waters and help our kids learn how to influence culture rather than let the culture change them? Well, today's guest has launched a brand new ministry for young people, and he's also written a new book that addresses topics like addiction, gender identity, pornography, hookup culture, racial tension, and consumerism. We're going to talk about it on today's podcast. My guest today was the Student Impact Director at Stand to Reason for 14 years. He has worked with junior high, high school, and college students for over 18 years. He speaks all over the country and has worked with groups like Summit Ministries, Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity, Saddleback Church, and Biola University. He has his bachelor's degree in Christian education with a master's degree in philosophy of religion and ethics from Talbot School of Theology. And he just launched a brand new ministry called Maven, and you can find their website at maventruth.com, M-A-V-E-N truth.com. So Brett Kunkle, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on with you, Elisa. I love what you're doing.
Well, thanks so much. And, you have a new book out called A Practical Guide to Culture, which you co-wrote with John Stonestreet. And I've read it. It's amazing. Everybody needs to go out and get it. In fact, I wrote a review of it on my blog, which listeners can find at elisachilders.com. And I said in my review that this is the kind of book that makes you want to go buy a case and just give it out to everybody that you meet.
Could you repeat that?
Yes.
Could you just repeat that? I think everyone in the audience really ought to hear that.
Yes, you need to get a Costco-sized case of this book and give it out to everybody. In fact, I get asked a lot when I'm teaching apologetics in churches. People will inevitably ask me, what's the best first apologetics book to get? And I had one that I would always kind of say. And after I read A Practical Guide to Culture, even though it's not your typical apologetics book in that you're covering philosophical arguments for the existence of God and things like that, but it's so practical, as the title says. It takes controversial topics like consumerism, addiction, entertainment, racial tension, homosexuality, pornography, and many more. And it really helps the reader to understand the Christian worldview and to really live out God's truth in a culture that's really kind of not on the same page with biblical teaching. So I'm just curious to hear you talk about the book. What inspired you to write it? And maybe tell us a little bit about your approach to some of these hot topics.
Yeah, I tell people there are 5 reasons that I wrote this book. Here are the 5 reasons: Alexis, Micah, Paige, Ella, Jonah. Right? Those are my 5 kids. And actually, I would say a 6th reason has been added in the last couple of weeks.
Yes.
My oldest daughter had our first grandchild, which is wild and amazing and crazy. My wife and I are very young grandparents.
I know.
We got married young. We had kids young. Our oldest daughter got married young. She's having kids young. So we're early 40s and grandparents. But I'm thinking, actually, this is great because this is gonna keep me in the world of youth for quite a long time now that I'm starting to have great.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of kids that are able to say they go surfing with grandpa.
That's right. Exactly. So those are the reasons why, because I know that my primary obligation is to disciple my own kids. And I've spent the last 25 years or so also working with young people in the church, 11 years in local church ministry, the last 14 years with Stand to Reason, and now Maven. Mm-hmm. And so, but even though I'm working with young people, around the country, and my primary obligation is my 5 kids. So this is what motivates me to do what I do, because at the end of the day, I want to be faithful in discipling my own kids. But there are a lot of things that I've learned, that my wife and I have learned through trial and error, through experience, through thinking carefully about these things, through the study of Scripture, all of that. That we've learned that I want to pass on to others, and so that's kind of what inspired me. But I've always had I've had a foot in the church. I think this is the benefit of starting in the local church, starting ministry in the local church, rather than at a parachurch organization. Mm-hmm. Is it kept me connected with the local church. It gave me insight into just day in, day out ministry. If you think about it, the local church is still God's plan A to reach the world. Right. It's also his plan B and plan C. There is no plan B and plan C, right? It's the local church. It's the body of Christ. That is the primary avenue through which God is reconciling the world into himself. So the church is primary. And this is, I think, is important to point out, because sometimes those of us who are in the apologetics world or part of the apologetics tribe, we sometimes may get frustrated with the local church. We may resonate more with a nonprofit apologetics organization, and we may sometimes want to kind of bypass the church, and that's just not an option.
Yeah.
So this shapes part of my approach to these kinds of things, because I know that the vast majority of people in our local churches, they're not as academically oriented as many of us.
Right.
I love to read, to listen to podcasts, to do education, all of that good stuff, which is important. And of course, I want to raise the bar in the church. There's often anti-intellectual on this, but I also know that the vast majority of people in the church aren't going to be, doing a PhD or writing a dissertation or diving into these things the way maybe you or I would. And so we can actually, I think, serve the church better by being very practical in our approach. And so that has, and so I think being in the church for 11 years made me realize the how important it is to translate this stuff, to translate the apologetics and the worldview material that we think is so important for people to grasp. Well, we got to translate that. I've seen time and time again people listen to a talk or get exposed to worldview and apologetic material, and it's so high level, it's not translated well, that they end up thinking mistakenly that this stuff is just not even relevant for them to even know. And and so sometimes, rather than just saying, well, that's the fault of the person, they're just not at the level they need to be, we also want to say, well, no, sometimes that's the fault of the communicators. And so what we want to do is, I think, be really good at translating this stuff. And that's what we try to do in this book, is translate well, communicate well to the church, because that's our primary audience: parents, leaders, pastors, Sunday school teachers, youth group leaders, all of that. And so take this stuff, not dumb it down, but translate it, make it accessible to people, and then also show them why it matters and help them to implement it. And that's where the practical stuff comes in. That's why we include lots of different practical ideas and steps, things that you can turn around and do with your kids immediately. So that is some of the stuff that I think about, and that shapes me and shapes John and I's, kind of approach to this book.
Yeah, and you did do a fantastic job of bringing all of these controversial topics into the practical realm for the average Christian, because I think that a lot of Christians, they know that they're living in a culture that has certain ideas about sexuality and pornography and entertainment and all these things, but they sometimes just maybe don't know how to practically apply what they believe to how they live. And I loved the example in your book when you were talking about culture. You tell the story of when you went to have ice cream with your kids, and you observed a mom who was taking pictures of her kids eating ice cream and, posting them on Instagram or something like that. And you were observing that this is something that culture has influenced, and you define culture and how that influences us and how we influence it. And that so resonated with me, because as a mom, I've been there. I've been at the ice cream shop, and you're looking around and everybody's just got their phones out taking pictures of their kids eating ice cream. And it just seems kind of, it's like, it's just culture. It's just what we do as culture. So with examples like that, What are some ways that Christian parents can be aware of the influences of our culture and be intentional in encouraging healthy behaviors in their kids?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this culture is what we swim in. In fact, we use the analogy, culture is for human beings what water is for fish. It's just the environment in which we live and move and have our being. We can't help but live in culture. But that's why it's so important then to think carefully about it, because it shapes us, whether we're conscious of its influence or not. And therefore, it's very powerful. So if we don't examine and engage the culture around us, I mean, it may not even occur to us that the world should be any different. Okay. Yeah. Now, here's the difference between us and fish, is that we make our own environment. We make our culture. We're actually part of building the very world that we inhabit. So on the flip side, this gives us, as followers of Christ, an extraordinary opportunity. We can make the world around us. We can shape and influence the culture around us. We can be active creators. We can work with God in culture building, and that can bring about great good for the glory of God. And I think it's important for us to talk about culture in those ways, because oftentimes I think Christians kind of take this very reductionistic approach or view of culture, right? We reduce culture to all the bad stuff that's out there in the world. So culture is, hip hop music, or culture is the PG-13 and rated R movies that are filled with, sex and violence and language and all that stuff. And it's godless Hollywood, and on and on and on. And of course, we would agree that, those things are part of culture. But that's not the whole story of culture, right? So this reduces it to all the bad stuff. And then what happens is that many Christians have this posture where they are constantly against anything and everything that we call culture. But, so this view, it fails to recognize that you simply find culture wherever you find human beings. It's not just all the bad stuff out there. It's what we make of the world. In fact, I think we quote from, his name just skipped my mind. Andy Crouch, right? He's got this great book on culture making. But culture is simply what we make of the world. So it includes the good and bad stuff. It includes all our ideas. It includes the institutions that we build, the structures that we build, the habits, the lifestyles. It includes all of that. And so when we realize that, we have a proper view of culture. We understand that there are good, bad, ugly, parts of culture. It's not all bad. It's not all good. In fact, this is where, and I think this is one of the really helpful things in our approach to culture, is to take a worldview approach and to carefully think about culture, and to number one, be grounded in the Christian worldview. And this is where in the book we talk about how Christians need to make a distinction between our current cultural moment that we're living in and the larger Christian story. Right? Well, there's this larger Christian story that's been unfolding. It's what we call it's the story of the world. It's a story of reality. This is the true story of what's going on, and that story started before 2017. That story has been going on for thousands of years, and it's unfolding, and we're just a small part of that story. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in our cultural moment that we fail to pull ourselves out and realize there's a larger story that's going on. This helps us on a number of levels. Number one, it helps us not to despair.
Right.
Sometimes I hear Christians just despair so much over where the culture is heading, and I understand, because there are times when I struggle with that as well. In fact, when I was writing this book and doing my work on this book, there were moments of kind of diving into the culture for weeks at a time, looking at stats, looking at the different trends, doing my research. And there were times where, I'll be honest, there were moments of despair.
Yeah.
because I was so focused on the cultural moment. And I think one of the most depressing things to write about was pornography. And the porn epidemic that's out there that just is devastating young people. And we just don't even, I think, have an idea right now of how bad it is and it's going to get. So you look at that particular instance in our particular cultural moment, and you can despair. And so what I had to do is pull myself out of that and realize, okay, this is not the whole story. The story doesn't begin and end with this moment. No, there's a much greater beginning, and there's a much better ending in the Christian story of reality, right? Yeah. And this is where we kind of divide it up in 4 parts, which is not unique to us. Lots of people talk about this, but I think it's a very helpful structure where you look at the Christian story broken into these 4 kind of acts, if you will: creation, right? The creation of the world, of the universe, of all good things by God. And when he creates, it's all good. Then you have the fall, where the fall of man breaks the world. Then you have redemption, which is, kind of the act that we're in. God is redeeming us as individuals, and redeeming cultures, and redeeming the world and reconciling it back to him. And ultimately, though, we know that there's a final act where he will restore all things, so restoration. And what that does is that helps us to realize there's this larger story going on. God is sovereign. Despair is a horrible strategy, even when it gets bad, even when things look tough and difficult, and that ultimately there's hope. There's hope that Christ is continuing to work even through the brokenness and the wickedness of humanity. And so I think that those kind of things are important for us to think about as we approach culture. We think about culture, and we think about how then do we influence the culture and raise our kids in that culture.
Yeah, and that was one of my favorite things about the book was it's what you called hope casting. And it's, basically what you just described, keeping our eyes on the bigger story and reminding ourselves that God's story continues to play out all around us. And that really does help keep us from losing hope as we see our culture go in certain directions. And so obviously you have a heart to equip the next generation. You've been in youth ministry for almost 2 decades. And just tell us what first inspired you to study apologetics and take the intellectual side of your faith more seriously.
Yeah, I grew up in the church. When I was a baby, my mom and dad came to Christ, and they were just on fire, and we plugged into the local church. So I had just the huge blessing of growing up in the church. I think that for me, that was a huge blessing. I had great experiences in the local churches that I was involved with, and so I grew up in healthy church life. A great mom and dad. Became when I got into junior high and high school, got involved with youth ministry at my local church, and was very involved in youth ministry. In fact, I became a student leader, and I would say, looking back, I was kind of what you considered the model Christian kid, if you will. Mm-hmm. Involved in student leadership, committed to Christ. My youth pastor could count on me for anything. In fact, my junior year in high school, I made a decision to go into full-time vocational ministry, right? And it was my freshman year in college. After having growing up in the church for the first 18 years of my life, my freshman year in college, I was at a local community college in Southern California. I took a class, Philosophy 101. And that is where my philosophy professor, Dr. David Lane, spent that semester dismantling my faith. And it wasn't, Professor Lane was not sometimes that stereotypical skeptical professor that we put up on the screen, in the Christian world. He was not angry. He was not vitriolic. He wasn't looking for every moment to come after me, the Christian. Now, I know that there are some professors like that, but he wasn't. In fact, I think he was more dangerous than those.
Right.
Because he was winsome. He was actually one of the most popular professors at this community college. He was charismatic. He was a surfer, so that was extra points for in my book. And he was thoughtful, and he directly challenged me. But I would say he challenged me in a winsome way. But he challenged me, and he dismantled me in class. There were times where he would directly challenge a particular aspect of Christianity, and there were times where he would give me the first shot at it. There were times where it seemed like he was trying to be fair-minded. And so he said, Brett, we know you're a Christian, so how would you respond to this particular objection? And often I would have no clue. This is the first time I'm hearing these things, so I'd never thought about any response to some of these objections. And so I was kind of tired of getting embarrassed in his class. And so what I would do is I'd go to his office afterwards and try to debate him in the privacy of his office, and that was just even worse. And there was one time where he had me pull out a Bible, and he spent like a good hour going through the Synoptic Gospels with me, and having me write down the discrepancies in the resurrection accounts. And this is something in the church, I never heard of this before. I didn't even realize that there were these differences in Matthew and Mark and Luke's accounts. And I sat there just in stunned silence in his office, because here it was right in front of my face. Here's the PhD, the smart guy, showing me that my Bible has errors in just the resurrection story. And I remember walking across the college campus that day to my car to go home. And I was shaken, and almost physically shaking, because I thought, this is real. This is huge. If he's right, then this seems to have serious implications for my faith and for Christianity. So that is then what got me into apologetics, because I just started asking people in my church questions, and there were some who had no ability to help me. I got the response like, well, Brett, you just have to have faith. Well, I just have to have faith. What does that mean? Like, you can't answer any of these questions, so I just have to have faith. So I got to kind of throw my mind out. And this was deeply unsatisfying to me, as it is to most young people who are being challenged. But I did find some people who introduced me to apologetics. And one of the very first books that was given to me was a book called Scaling the Secular City by J.P. Moreland.
Oh, yeah.
And Moreland is one of my favorite philosophers and apologists.
Yeah,
he's had a significant influence in my life. Yeah, he's great. And I was able to study under Moreland, doing my MA in philosophy at Talbot. But I looked at that book, and I started kind of going through it, and I was lost. It was so, for me at that point, as a young college student, it was so deep and technical, but I realized, okay, gosh, this guy, at least he sounds really smart. He seems to know his stuff. Okay, so there's some smart guys on our side. And this began to open up the whole world of apologetics to me. And I realized, and I discovered, that there's this incredible wealth of resources, apologetic resources. These questions aren't unique to me. Christians have been defending the faith for 2,000 years now. But the tragedy was that I had grown up in the church, and for the first 18 years of my life, I had no clue that there was this, wealth of knowledge, and that we had the ability to defend the faith. So that is what led me to start studying apologetics, and to really dive much deeper into my faith. And so I was actually doing youth ministry at the time. It was an intern at my church. I was doing junior high ministry. And I started thinking, oh my gosh, these kids that I'm working with, they were me 4 or 5 years ago, and they're going to be me, 4 or 5 years from now in a college classroom getting smashed by a professor. And so I started, just as I was learning apologetics, I started teaching it. And I'm sure when I first started teaching it, it was just horrible, but But I realized, hey, these students need to know this stuff. They need to be equipped. They need to know, the justification for their faith. They need to be able to give a reason for the hope that's in them.
Yeah.
So that's really what it was great having an outlet to be able to teach, because that forced me to learn the apologetics well. There's nothing to help facilitate learning in your own life than having to teach something, right? And so that really helped me, and it also helped me to translate, because I'm having to take material from J.P. Moreland and translate it for a 7th grade squirrely little boy, so it was great training.
Yeah. And you don't just teach the kids apologetics, as you have been for so many years, but you also started a series of mission trips with young people to Berkeley and to Utah that really kind of brings all of that teaching and training into reality, I would say. So tell us about how these trips got started, and a little bit about what goes on during one of these trips and what the main focus of the mission is on these particular trips that you take these youth to Berkeley and Utah.
Yeah, the reason I do these trips with young people is because this kind of trip had a huge experience, or a huge impact on me as I experienced it. I was an undergrad at Biola University. Well, eventually I transferred to Biola University from the community college and finished up my undergrad there. But one of my roommates or dorm mates invited me on a spring break mission trip, and it was a spring break mission trip to Utah. So I started attending these trainings. And the guy who's training us is training us in theology. And I remember some of the first training sessions were just all on the Trinity. And it was, I hadn't had this kind of deep, rich theological teaching and training before, and I was learning all kinds of things. And then I go up to Utah, and I'm scared out of my mind, because basically what he did was put us in situations where he had to talk to Mormons. And yet that challenge, the training and then being challenged and then, then engaging, it grew me so much in not just my knowledge, but then my passion for the truth. It has just a profound influence on me. And so I realized, oh my gosh, this is an incredible experience. And how can I do this with my young people? So eventually, when I started doing high school and college ministry, I started taking my ministries to Utah on these Utah mission trips. And then when I joined Stand to Reason, I thought, well, gosh, I can do this with other groups. And so we started doing Utah mission trips. In fact, the very first mission trips I led through my work at Stand to Reason was with Jim Wallace, J. Warner Wallace. When he was a youth pastor here in Southern California, we got connected. I started taking his groups to Utah. He said, hey, these things have just had such a huge impact on our group. And so Jim was the one who kind of sparked the idea for an apologetics type trip, because on Utah, we're going and we're having more theological conversations, right? And conversations on scripture. And he said, okay, so we've done a couple of these, but can you put together the same kind of experience and trip where we would engage more apologetics and philosophy and how to think? And he had some students in his youth ministry who had gone to Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And so he said, hey, take us to Berkeley or something. We can connect with those students. And Berkeley, of course, is a radical place.
Right.
And so let's go the craziest place in the U.S. and do it there. So that's where then I put together the Berkeley missions experience, which is more apologetically focused. And the idea behind the trips is really to put young people in situations that, number one, challenge them, but that force them then to talk about this stuff. It's it's the idea that we need to get this stuff out of the classroom and into real life, because ultimately apologetics, one of the purposes of apologetics is to serve the gospel in evangelism. And so, but if you're just doing that apologetic work in the classroom all the time and it just stays in the classroom, then it's not serving its intended purpose in terms of reaching a lost world. And so, but then what we also discovered through this is that the challenge really motivates young people, right? We think our young people need to know theology and apologetics. Okay, so how are we going to motivate them to actually study that, right? You can hand them a systematic theology book and say, here, read this. You need to know this. And 1 out of 500,000 evangelical kids
Yeah.
is going to take you up on that one.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you what I've seen over the last, 17 years that I've been doing these trips, 18 years, is that you let a student get challenged. You let a student get ripped apart by a Mormon
Yeah.
or an atheist or a Berkeley student. They come back to you motivated, and they say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know how to answer this, and they said this, and I didn't." They pointed out this scripture, and I had no answer to it, and it seems to support Mormonism. Then there's this internal motivation and drive that starts to arise in them, and then they come to you and ask you for that systematic theology book, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hugely motivational, and then it also gets young people sharing the gospel. And what I found is that the vast majority of young people in our churches have never even shared the gospel with a friend. They've never done that. And on these trips, it's the first time. And what we see happen is that they get lit up, right? I mean, you start living your life for the cause of the gospel, and there's almost nothing that will light up your relationship with Christ and light a fire under you and give you passion for the cause of Christ than actually living on mission for Him. And so we see that with young people. And so it's so fun to watch. And it's helped me to understand that more and more of our activity needs to be done outside of the four walls of the church, outside of a building, and really engaging the world. And that's when all this, theoretical stuff really hit the rubber hits the road, and it becomes very practical. And it's amazing what happens on these trips.
So if parents want to learn more about these trips, is there a website they can go to find out information?
Yeah. So our website is maventruth.com. We don't have a ton of information up right at this moment, but this fall, we just launched the ministry in September. Mm-hmm. This fall, we are building our website. We'll be adding more information. We'll be adding more content. If anyone wants more specific information, they can go onto the Maven website, and there are different links at the top of the page, and there's a contact us link, and what they can do is they can make a request for more information. Also, I would just throw this out: if someone just wants to email us, they can email us at info at maventruth.com and say, "Hey, I want more information on these mission trips," and we will send them information and actually a little video trailer of the trip. So, I mean, it's one thing to describe it. It's another thing to actually see it and to go on it. It's almost like I can't do justice to how incredible these trips are.
Great. And so as we close out today, tell us about your new ministry and specifically why you chose the word Maven. What does Maven mean?
Yeah, well, we are a youth-focused ministry. So we have two target audiences. One is junior high, high school, and college students. We want to help young people to know truth and to defend it, and that's a vital, important part of what we're going to do. But it's not the end-all, be-all, and that's where I think sometimes those of us in the apologetics world make a mistake of letting that be the end-all, be-all, and then I watch people kind of burn out on apologetics. We want to help young people know truth, but then we also want them to apply that to the rest of their lives, and so we also want to help them pursue goodness and create beauty. Right? So we've taken these kind of classic transcendental categories, truth, goodness, and beauty, and we want to help young people know and live the truth of Christianity. But then our second target audience is helping the people who are discipling the next generation. So we want to come alongside parents and youth pastors and grandparents and Christian educators to do the same thing with their young people. And so part of that is rewrapping this for a new generation. I mean, if you think, I've been working with young people for a long time now, and you see some of the changes in this current generation. They are media saturated. They are image based. They are driven by their feelings much more than thinking. And so how do you reach that kid? How do you reach a kid who will get onto a website and simply if the design of the website seems outdated or clunky, he'll bounce, right? He's out of there. He's gone in 10 seconds. And it doesn't matter how good your content is. If it's wrapped in a way that doesn't appeal to them, they're out. And now, look, we can bemoan that and complain about it and say, kids these days, right? Or we can work really hard to reach that kid and to put more effort and resources into repackaging the truth for this next generation. So that's what we want to do. And that's one of the reasons why we came up with the name Maven, because we wanted to pick a name that was not apologetic-y, if you know what I mean. We didn't want it to sound overly academic, because that doesn't appeal to your typical evangelical kid in your typical evangelical church. And but we wanted also a name that helped communicate what we want to be about. And a maven is someone who has knowledge in a particular area and then passes that knowledge on to others. It's one who knows the truth and passes it on. So you may have sometimes the word is used in the context of like a fashion maven or a finance maven, right? They have knowledge of these areas. Well, we want to be a maven for young people when it comes to following Jesus, when it comes to Christianity. We want to help pass on the knowledge of Christ to these young people. And then we want to help them become mavens as well. We want to help them do the same thing. And then we want to come alongside parents and leaders and help them to be mavens with their work with young people. So that's how we came up with the name. And part of it was, running it by young people as well. Like, what do you think? How does this ring to you? How does this feel to you? What do you think about this name? And and a lot of young people just thought, I really like this, and so we that's some of the thinking behind the name Maven. But that's what it means, as one who knows the truth and passes it on to others.
I love it. I'm so excited to see what God does through your ministry in the coming years. So the website again is maventruth.com. And don't forget to grab Brett and John Stonestreet's book, A Practical Guide to Culture, as well. Brett, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you can go to elisachilders.com and click the subscribe button, or you can simply subscribe to the Elisa Childers podcast on iTunes.